run over. Okay. Um, I'm going to start off with a song by an Oklahoma native. This is when I worked for lawyers for years, and I'm not one myself, but I married into a family of them. And I know two songs about lawyers, and this is one of them. It's written by great Oklahoma native Woody Guthrie. Way out in Reno, Nevada, where the romances bloom and fade, a great Philadelphia lawyer fell in love with a Hollywood maid. Come, love, and away we'll wander, out where the lights are so bright. I'll win you a divorce from your husband, and we can get married tonight. Now Wild Bill was a gun-toting cowboy, had 10 notches carved on his gun, and all of the boys around Reno left Wild Bill's darling alone. One night, as Bill was returning from riding the range in the cold, he thought of his Hollywood darling. Her love was as lasting as gold. But as Bill drew near to the window, two shadows he saw on the shade. Was the great Philadelphia lawyer making love to Bill's Hollywood maid. Now the night was as still as the desert, and the moon hanging high overhead. Bill listened a while at the window. He could hear every word that was said. Your hands are so pretty and lovely, your form is so rare and divine. Come, go back with me to Philadelphia and leave this wild cowboy behind. Well, tonight, back in old Pennsylvania, amongst her beautiful pines, there's one less Philadelphia lawyer in old Philadelphia tonight. Got a little thing here on my screen I want to get rid of. There we go. It was the license plate shaped thing saying it was being recorded. This next song, I don't know, it seems like when I go through the songs I know, over half and maybe 3/4 of them end up with somebody dying. I don't know, maybe I was just a morbid child or something. It's definitely a strange one. But this is a song, it's one of the old ballads from the early part of the 20th century about a true event that occurred in February of 1925. In fact, the entire event straddled 2 weeks that the date of my father's birth, which was February 7th of 25. This went on from January 31st to the 16th of February. And it was one of the first major media events in this country, media circus, I should say. And it involved a young spelunker, amateur explorer who met a sad end. This is the song that was written about it that Vernon Dalhart recorded back in 1925 or 6. Now come all you young people and listen while I tell the fate of Floyd Collins, a lad we all knew well. His face was fair and handsome, his heart was true and brave. His body now is sleeping in a lonely sandstone cave. His poor old mother begged him from folly to desist. His gray-haired father warned him of the dangers and the risk. But Floyd would not listen to the good advice they gave. His body now is sleeping in a lonely sandstone cave. How sad the story, it fills our eyes with tears. His memory, it will linger for many, many years. The broken-hearted father who tried his boy to save is a-weeping tears of sorrow at the door of Floyd's cave. And how the news did travel, oh how the news did go. It traveled through the papers and over the radio. How the people waited for all the news they gave about the brave explorer trapped in that awful cave. The rescue party labored, it worked both night and day to move the mighty barrier that stood within the way. To rescue Floyd Collins, that was their battle cry. We'll never, no, we'll never let Floyd Collins die. But on that fateful morning, the sun rose in the sky. The party, it still labored, will save him by and by. But oh, how sad the ending, his life they could not save. His body rests eternal deep in that silent cave. So young folks, oh take warning at Floyd Collins' fate, and get right with your maker before it is too late. It may not be a sand cave in which we find our tomb, but at the bar of judgment we too must meet our doom. I think we'll do something a little more cheerful here. This is next song is one that was featured. It was written by two gentlemen named Dwight Latham and Mo Jaffe, but it was made famous on the 1940s and 50s radio show of Lonzo and Oscar. And I learned it from my Uncle Donald while traversing I-20 going to Dallas for a family reunion one year. And I got to sit in the front seat going over, and my brother and a cousin were riding with us. And I got to ride in the back seat of the Pinto wagon coming back. And for those of you who don't remember the Ford Pinto, I can attest that the front seat is much more comfortable than the back. But it's a song about family. Many, many years ago, when I was 23, I got married to a widow who was pretty as could be. This widow had a grown-up daughter who had hair of red. My father fell in love with her, and soon they two were wed. This made my dad my son-in-law and changed my very life. My daughter is my mother, 'cause she is my father's wife. To complicate the matter, even though it brought me joy, I soon became the father of a bouncing baby boy. This little baby then became a brother-in-law to Dad. He also is my uncle, and it makes me very sad. For if he is my uncle, then that also makes him brother to the widow's grown-up daughter, who of course is my stepmother. My father's wife then had a son who kept them on the run. He became my grandchild 'cause he was my daughter's son. My wife is now my mother's mother, and it makes me blue because although she is my wife, she's my grandmother too. Now if my wife is my grandmother, I am her grandchild, and every time I think of it, it nearly drives me wild. My life has now become the strangest case you ever saw. As husband to my own grandmother, I'm my own grandpa. Oh, I'm my own grandpa. I'm my own grandpa. It sounds funny, I know, but it really is so. I'm my own grandpa. And I've known families like that. It's what being in social work will do for you. This next one is one of my favorite songs in the whole world. It sounds like an old ballad, but it was actually written in 1951 by a man named James Stephens, and I learned it off of the Weavers on Tour album, which was one of the records from my uncle's collection that I asked for a copy of on my 9th birthday and got it. Years later, I met Ronnie Gilbert, who was the female member of the Weavers, at the Kerrville Folk Festival, and I told her that story, and she said, "Oh, well, you were a precocious child, weren't you?" And I feel very fortunate in my life to have met 2 of the 4 original Weavers. And I've been singing this song for 60 years, and we'll sing it as long as... Oh, I sang it from a 3rd grade class, and they called my mother. As I sat down one evening, it was in a small cafe, a 40-year-old waitress to me these words did say, "Well, I see that you are a logger, and not just a common bum, for nobody but a logger stirs his coffee with his thumb." Now my lover was a logger, and there's none like him today. If you'd pour whiskey on it, he would eat a bale of hay. And he never shaved his whiskers from off of his horny hide. He'd just drive them in with a hammer and bite them off inside. My lover came to see me. It was on one freezing day. He held me in a fond embrace which broke 3 vertebrae. Then he kissed me when we parted, so hard that he broke my jaw. I could not speak to tell him he'd forgot his Mackinaw. I saw my lover leaving, sauntering through the snow, going gaily homeward at 48 below. Now the weather, it tried to freeze him. It tried its level best at 100 degrees below zero. He buttoned up his vest. Well, it froze clean through to China, and it froze to the stars above at 1,000 degrees below zero. It froze my logger love. They tried in vain to thaw him, and would you believe me, sir, they made him into axe blades to cut the Douglas fir. And so I lost my lover, and to this cafe I come, and here I wait till someone stirs his coffee with his thumb. Yeah, they were having, I don't know what my teacher had in mind. We were having like a little in-class music session, and she was asking the kids if they had a song they wanted to share with the class. And I said, "Oh, I do. Sing your song." And that was what I sang. And my mother said they called her. This was at Harold Budd Elementary School on Marsalis Avenue in Oak Cliff section of Dallas back in, I believe it must have been in March of '62, somewhere around in there. And despite, Dallas being the hotbed of liberal thinking that it was in those days, they didn't see why someone my age should be singing a song like that in a public school. And I don't know. My mother approved, and that was all that mattered. I'm going to jump into a biblical story. This is one by Grandpa Jones, who, there's a handful of people in this world in music and other things that are kind of heroes of mine, and he was one of them. Just such a wonderful entertainer, and if I could frail a banjo the way he could, I probably would have quit doing anything else a long time ago. Anyway, this is one of the chapters, story from one of the chapters in the Bible. We're all familiar with it. In the Bible we are told of the prophet who was called to a city steeped in awful sin. All the people in that place were devoid of saving grace, and the prophet seemed afraid to enter in. Then the prophet forth was sent, that old Nineveh might repent. But instead of that, to Tarshish he set sail. Oh, the wind began to blow, overboard did Jonah throw, and he found a mercy seat inside the whale. Over there, in that land so bright and fair, we'll tell 'em all about it over there. In that hallelujah land, I'll take Jonah by the hand, and we'll tell 'em all about it over there. In the cold and briny deep, tears of grief did Jonah weep, and the big fish spat him out upon the shore. Then he quickly went his way, preached to Nineveh night and day, for he did not dare to backslide anymore. There are those who don't believe that the whale could him receive, but still that does not prove my song untrue. There are whales on every side with their big mouths open wide. Take care, my friend, that one don't swaller you. Over there, in that land so bright and fair, we'll tell 'em all about it over there. In that hallelujah land, I'll take Jonah by the hand, and we'll tell 'em all about it over there. Many souls are tossed about by the whales of fear and doubt, but the Savior wants to take them by the hand. If you'll only Him obey, He will save you right away and lead you over to the promised land. Over there, in that land so bright and fair, we'll tell 'em all about it over there. In that hallelujah land, I'll take Jonah by the hand, We'll tell 'em all about it over there. Thank you. That was good. That's the first time I've ever sung that one, I think, in any kind of public venue. It's eminently survivable. Okay. We're ripping on here. We've got, I think, just about an adequate amount of time left. This is a song, again, I've never done this one in a public venue, so you're taking your chance with this one, as I am. This one dates back to the colonial days, and I wish I had time for a lengthy explanation about it, but it had to do with old money and new money and defying the British. I'll put it that way. 9 men to guard the British rank, and 5 to watch the town about, and 2 to stand at either hand, and 1 to let John Tenner out. There was 80 weight of Spanish iron between his neck bone and his knee, but Billy took Johnny up under his arm, and he lugged him away right manfully. And Billy broke locks, Billy broke bolts, and Billy broke all that he came nigh, until he came to the dungeon door, and that he broke right manfully. So they stole them a horse, and away they rode, and who but they rode manfully, until they came to the river bank, and the river was running wild and free, and the British were coming hard on their heels, and who but they stood fearfully, till Billy took Johnny up on his back, and he carried him away quite easily. And Billy broke locks, Billy broke bolts, and Billy broke all that he came nigh, until he came to the dungeon door, and that he broke right manfully. Then they called at the inn for a room to dance, and who but they danced merrily, and the very best dancer among them all was old John Webb, who was just set free. Here's a song story that might be true or it might be a tall tale. You have to decide for yourself. It involved a fellow from Nebraska that fell in with a bunch of Texas cowboys at a campfire one night. And they asked him if he could tell a story, and he said he would. Come sit down, all you cowboys, come gather by the fire, and I'll tell you a tale that'll shut the mouth of all you Texas liars. Never know that I'm a stranger and I'm just passing through, but I swear upon my horse and saddle that this tale is true. There was a farmer of the plains, a free man he was born, who out behind his barn dropped a kernel of corn. Well, the lightning flashed and the thunder rolled and blew the candles out. An hour after the rain had stopped, that corn began to sprout. A day after that corn had first begun to show its leaves, that stalk had grown as big as a California redwood tree. And the farmer's son, thinking that the growing soon would stop, set out to climb this oddity, intent to reach the top. But soon that boy got frightened, as scared as he could be, and he set his sights on climbing down that old corn tree. But the corn was streaking 90 miles an hour, heaven bound, and there never was a chance that boy would ever reach the ground. The farmer, upon hearing his son's poor frightened cries, set out to chop that hustling stalk whose tip now reached the skies. And though the plainsman's axe was sharp, and though each stroke cut deep, by the time he'd struck a second time, his first was out of reach. Well, he never saw his son again, but he did not get forlorn, for for daily there fell from the clouds an ear of eaten corn. Each ear was long as the Rio Grande and round as a hornet's hive. My God, the farmer cried, that boy's got an appetite. Now it weren't too many weeks thereafter, maybe 6 or 7, that the farmer died and went to meet his maker up in heaven. He arrived at the pearly gates as day was a-getting done, and he started asking angels had they heard about his son. St. Peter called the farmer to his side to have a talk with news about that boy and that famous corn stalk. He said, a boy that fit your son's description passed through here last week. He was moving so darn fast we didn't have time to speak. Don't look at me with scornful eyes or send me to the cold, for I swear there ain't an untrue word in the story I've just told. And I tell you this 'cause I know that cowboys are a rambling sort, and the moral is worth listening to if you're ever heading north. Now don't go climb Nebraska corn. Don't go climb Nebraska corn. Get on your knees and pray that you'll never see the day that you'll have to climb Nebraska corn. Now, it's coming out about right. I want to wind this up here. This is a song I learned from my brother. He came home from his first tour in Europe, having learned it, and sang it. My mother always loved it. And it's a story about the time in Ireland when Gaelic was forbidden to be spoken by the British overseers, I guess it was. And so one of the constabulary decided to question a gentleman who he felt was not following that law. And this is the story of it. The policeman walked out, oh so proud on his beat, when a vision came to him of stripes on his sleeve. Promotion, he whispered, I'll try for today, so come with me, Mr. Right to Rely. Come tell me your name, says the limb of the law, to the little fat man selling wares on the straw. What's that, sir? Me name, sir? Why, 'tis there on display, and me name it is Moses Right to Rely. Now the trial came on, and it lasted a week. One judge said 'twas German, another 'twas Greek. Prove you're Irish, said the policeman, and beyond that say nay, and we'll sit on it, Moses Right to Rely. Now the prisoner stepped up there as stiff as a crutch. Are you Irish or English or German or Dutch? I'm a Jew, sir, I'm a Jew, sir, come over to stay, and me name it is Moses Right to Rely. Why, we're two of a kind, said the judge to the Jew. You're a cousin of Briscoe, and I am one too. This numbskull has blundered, and for it shall pay. Wish it that's right, said Moses Right to Rely. There's a garbage collector who works on our street. He once was a policeman, the pride of the beat. And he moans all the night and he groans all the day, saying Moses Right to Rely, Rely. I once sang that at an event I was invited to entertain at, and the audience was largely composed of LEOs, that is, law enforcement officers. They didn't like it for some reason.
Well,
never got asked back there.
Thank you, David. You've been poking at lawyers and law enforcement officers and all kinds of people. This is the tradition of folk music, I'm sure. I had heard that the melodies of the cowboy songs kind of circulated around and got used with different words, but that's the first time I heard another one that went with Sweet Betsy from Pike. That that's really fun.
Yeah. I've
Thank
had
you.
a wonderful time this evening and would love to stick around and do more, but I realize the show
Well,
must go on.
it's time for the show to go on. Thank you, David. And you are welcome to listen, of course, because many more wonderful things will happen this evening.
Thank you
Now
so much.
we borrowed David from across the river from Texas, and we also have borrowed our sign language interpreters. At least I know Joel Hill lives in Texas, and Livy Tipton often comes there for the Tejas Storytelling Festival in Denton, which is where many of us first saw those folks, as well as David. They will be joining us this evening. And for starters, Libby. Oops, I've forgotten already. Libby will be interpreting first for Laura. Laura Packer is our featured teller this evening. I want to be sure, because the slides announcing this came up before David started, but I want to be sure that we must thank the Oklahoma Arts Council and the National Endowment for the Arts for providing grant funding that made this online programming possible. And in particular, we must thank Valerie Kimball, who made the grants possible. Yay! A very special and essential skill for an arts organization. Laura did a workshop for us this morning, a wonderful workshop on telling personal stories. She says that she grew up listening to stories from her parents, her father telling stories of books and movies, and her mother was a librarian, and so she just assumed that you hear stories and retell them, and then she found them in books, and she heard professional storytellers such as Brother Blue telling stories, and ever since she has been traveling and telling stories now over Zoom to build bridges, to offer healing and create a kinder world. We saw that in action in her wonderful workshop this morning. I've heard her tell traditional stories that were reset in other places and took us into deeper channels in those stories than Disney ever wondered about. And I've heard her tell personal experience stories too, as we heard about this morning. And so we are looking forward to a variety of stories. I'm going to put the titles of some of her books and some of her contact information. I'll put that into the chat line later on. I hope you know how to save the chat by scrolling down, by going, when you get into the chat and you find those three little dots in the corner, and click on that, and it gives you a chance to save the chat so that you'll have all that information for later. Now it's time to hear from Laura Packer.
I am so happy to be here. My gratitude to Fran and Chester and Dean and Libby and Joel and Valerie for getting the funding, and everyone. Thank you for inviting me here, for creating this space where so much amazing story and art is happening, and it is an honor to share stories with you. I have 4 or 5 stories for you tonight, ranging from traditional to original stuff that I made up to personal. I'll close with a personal story for those of you who are in the workshop, and I'm very happy to be here. This first story is called Stars Like Embers, and it is from the San people of Southern Africa. Let me just get myself straight. There we go. And I love starting with this because I like starting with stories that begin with, in the beginning, the world was dark. Not dark the way your bedroom might be after you turn out the lights, or even dark the way your closet might be should you close the door. No, the world was dark. There was no sun. There was no moon. There were no stars. And so the people lived in small, distant villages, one here, one there, all of them far away from one another. They would look out of their villages in that eternal darkness and see tiny little flickering lights. And that's how they knew that there were other people out there, other people with a fire in the middle of their village, just the way the people in this village had a fire in the middle of theirs. No one stepped out into the dark, or only very infrequently, because the dark was dangerous. No one knew what was in the dark. No one knew what animals or threats might lurk, but they could hear the sounds of something prowling around the village. They could hear the yowls and the growls. The dark was too dangerous, and so the villages stayed far apart. There was a young girl who grew up in one of these villages and spent hour after hour after hour standing at the edge of the village looking out at those little flickering lights here and there. And she hungered to know who was in those villages. Was there a little girl like her looking out into the darkness at the flickering lights? And so when she was a little older, she said to her mother, "Mother, I am going out into the darkness." And her mother was horrified. She felt her heart begin to pound. And she said, "Mother, I am going into the darkness to go walk to one of those flickering lights to the other villages, to see if they are like us. Do they eat foods like we eat? Do they have songs and stories like ours?" And her mother said, "You mustn't do this. This is dangerous. You must stay here. No one knows what is in the dark." But the girl was adamant, "Mother, I'm going." And her mother said, "Please, sleep, and when you wake, let us discuss it again." The girl fell asleep, but her mother stayed up all night, staring into those glowing, shifting embers in the village fire, thinking that she cannot let her child go, and yet she knew she couldn't stop her. So when the girl woke, she said to her, "You will go, and I will go with you." And then the mother took some clay and shaped it into a bowl and set it into the embers of the fire so it would grow strong and hard. And she shaped a lid out of clay and let that too sit in the embers of the fire to dry out and be strong and hard. And when they were dry, she used a stick to pull them out again. And when they had cooled, she scooped the bowl into the embers so there were coals glowing in her hand, and put the lid on top, and said to her daughter, "Now we can go." They said goodbye to all the people in their village, and they began to walk. Now, without sun or moon or stars, they didn't know how long they walked. They simply walked until they were tired, and then gathered what they could that they thought would burn, and the mother set the embers into the debris, and a little fire flared up. They looked behind them, and they could see their village fire almost as big as it had been when they left earlier. And there in the distance was a little flickering flame that seemed no bigger than it had been when they started. They slept by the fire, and when they were done sleeping, the mother took the bowl, and dug it into those coals and threw the coals up into the sky, so they scattered in a line from the village where they had started to where they were now. And then she put more of the coals into the bowl and covered it, and they walked until they were tired. And again, when they stopped, they gathered up debris, and they set the fire burning, and they looked behind them, and the fire behind them was smaller now, and the fire in front a little bigger. They slept, and in the morning the girl said, "Mother, let me help." And together they dug that bowl into the embers and threw them up into the sky, so there was a line of burning embers, showing the people of their village where they were, letting them know that they were well, and letting the people in front of them know that they were coming. And they walked. They grew tired. They gathered debris, they set a fire, they slept, and now the girl dug the bowl into the embers and threw them up in the sky. The fire behind them was so small, and the one in front of them was so large. They walked, and when they came to the next village, there were people waiting for them. And they spoke a language that was similar enough. They talked, and they laughed, and they wept. And the people in that village pointed at the stars up in the sky, and the mother and daughter nodded. Yes, we left a path, so you can visit our village, and the people of our village can visit you. They ate. The foods were not so different. They sang songs. They told stories. That was a long, long time ago. But if you go out on a dark night and look up at the sky, you will see that trail of stars that stretches from one end of the horizon to the other. And those stars are there to let you know that you are not alone, that if you follow them, you will find people with whom you can weep and laugh and share stories. The next story I would like to share with you is a fractured fairy tale. As Fran mentioned, this is one of my own creation. I hope you enjoy it. Once upon a time, there was a farmer who lived on his farm out past the edge of the village, and he was very poor, because this is a fairy tale, and in fairy tales, farmers are always poor. And he lived on his farm with his animals and with his daughter, who was smart and funny and kind and good at solving problems. They had a tradition where every year on her birthday, he would wake her up in the morning and he would say, "Happy birthday, sweetheart. I am so proud and happy that you are my daughter. You are smart, you're funny, you're kind, you're good at solving problems. I love you so much." And every year on her birthday, the young woman would listen to this, the girl, the young woman, and she would be so glad that her father loved her so much. But inside, inside there was a little twinge, because he never said she was beautiful. And truthfully, she wasn't. At best, you might say that she was plain, but really, she was homely. And so it was on her 18th birthday that her father knocked on her door in the morning and woke her up and said, "Happy birthday, sweetheart. I am so proud that you are my daughter. You are smart, you're funny, you're kind, you're good at solving problems. I love you so much." And she woke up and gave her father a hug and kiss, but felt that twinge inside. And then he said, "Come on, get up. I have a gift for you." "A gift? Father, we can't afford any gifts." And her father said, No. Just come with me. So he went downstairs and she got up and got dressed. She went downstairs and together they went across the hall, out the door, across the yard, around the corner, and into the barn. And there, in the barn, was a mule. The girl looked at the mule. The mule looked at her. "Father," she said, "thank you, but what am I going to do with a mule?" And her father said, "Are you kidding? You are so smart that I know you will figure out something. You're not going to stick around this little town. This mule will take you places." And she shrugged and smiled and kissed him, and they went inside and had breakfast. And the day passed the way it always did. But remember, I told you, this girl was smart. All day long she was thinking about that mule. When she went to bed, she lay there staring up at the ceiling that she looked at every night of her life, and she thought. Now this girl, she had been around the fairy tale block a time or two, and as she lay there thinking, she thought, "Oh, of course, the mule must be enchanted." So she got up, went down the stairs, across the hall, out the door, across the yard, around the corner, and into the barn. She looked at the mule. The mule looked at her. She looked around. No one was there. And so she leaned forward and when she opened her eyes, the mule was still a mule. Fine, it isn't enchanted, she thought, and she made her way back into the house and upstairs and went back to bed. The next morning, when she got up, she and her father were having breakfast, and he said, "Darling, would you mind taking the wood that I gathered out in the forest into the village to sell? It's the market day, and it'll bring us a little bit of money." And she sighed. She hated going to the market. Whenever she went into town, all the pretty girls in the village, they looked at her and they went, and the boys would pick flowers and they would hold them out to her, making fun of her, saying, "Ugly, ugly." She hated going into the village, but she loved her father. And then he said, "I know, you can tie the wood to the mule and you can ride it. See, I told you that a mule was a great gift." So she agreed. When she was done eating breakfast, she brushed her teeth and then went out to the barn. She tied the wood to the mule and then she hopped up onto the mule. Now, she didn't know it, but the mule was enchanted. When she hopped up on that mule, she was no longer ugly. Now she was beautiful, but she didn't know. So she rode the mule into town. And when she got there, everyone just stared as she went by. They had never seen such a lovely young woman. And the boys, instead of throwing pebbles at her the way they usually did and holding out flowers saying ugly, they held out the flowers and said, "Please, please, miss, take my flowers." She thought everyone was making fun of her in a new way. And so she rode the mule around the little shack where she and her father sold things. This is a fairy tale, so no one chased her behind the shack. Don't ask me why. But when she got there, she hopped down off the mule and became her own plain self again. She untied the wood and spent the day selling it, and at the end of the day, she hopped back up on the mule and became beautiful and rode out of town while everyone just stared as she went by. She got home. She hopped off the mule. She went inside, and she and her father talked and had dinner, and then she went to bed. But what she didn't know is that after she rode out of town, the prince rode in. I know this is a really big coincidence, but things like this happen in fairy tales, so just put up with it. The prince was a good prince. He wanted to know what was happening. Were people happy? Was there anything they needed? So he rode into town to hear all of the gossip, and the only thing that everyone was talking about was the beautiful young woman who had rode in on a mule. Now, the handsome prince on his beautiful white horse, he was intrigued. So he asked around, and everyone said, "Well, she rode out down towards that farmer's house, the one with the ugly daughter, but we don't know where she went after that because it's not that girl." And the prince thought, well, I can go ask. So the next morning, the young woman was in her house with her father eating breakfast when she heard a knock on the door. She got up and opened the door, and there was a handsome prince on a beautiful white horse. He looked down at her. This clearly was not the beautiful girl who was riding the mule. So the prince said, "Excuse me, but have you heard about a beautiful young woman riding a mule?" And the girl thought, I'm the only one around here who rides a mule, but I'm not beautiful. So she looked up at the prince and said, "No." The prince looked down. Perhaps you have a beautiful sister." "No." "A beautiful cousin?" "No," she said. "But remember, I told you she was smart." So then she said, "I do have a beautiful friend. Beautiful cousin, excuse me, and she will be here tomorrow morning. So if you come here at about this time, you might get to meet her." The prince was satisfied, and off he rode. The young woman went upstairs to her room. She picked up a mirror and looked at herself, and there she was, the same old ugly face that had looked at her every day of her life. But she went downstairs, across the hall, out the door, across the yard, around the corner, and into the barn, and hopped up onto the mule, and then she was beautiful. The mule was enchanted. So the next morning she got up extra early. She brushed her teeth and washed her face. She put on her best dress. She ran downstairs, across the hall, out the door, across the yard, around the corner, into the barn, and hopped onto the mule, and then rode to the front of the house, just as the handsome prince on his beautiful white horse rode up to her. He looked delighted. And so the two of them went riding around the village. And as they rode, everyone just stared. They had never seen a couple that beautiful before. And they talked back and forth as they rode. And at the end of the day, he rode her back to her home and asked if he could come calling again. She agreed. The next day they rode through the forest. And as they rode, they talked back and forth. He had never met anybody this funny before. She was a riot. And at the end of the ride, he asked if he could come calling again, and she agreed. And the next day they rode through the fields. And as they rode, he told her what it was like to be a prince and all of the troubles that he had. She listened and then offered some suggestions. They were great ideas. She was really good at solving problems, and her suggestions were fair and kind. By the time they got back to her house, he had fallen madly in love. And so he said to her, "Not only are you the most beautiful woman I have ever met, but you are smart, you're funny, you're kind, you're good at solving problems. I love you. Please, will you marry me?" The young woman, remember, I said she was smart. She said, "Yes, but on one condition. The first time you saw me, I was on my mule, and I want you to always have the feelings in your heart that you have right now. So I will spend time with you only when I am on my mule and you are on your horse." And the prince agreed. They talked with her father, who was absolutely delighted. And the next day off they rode to the capital city to be wed. When they got there, they rode into the church, he on his horse, she on her mule. They rode up the aisle, they stopped in front of the altar, they spoke their vows to each other, they leaned over the gap between the horse and the mule and kissed, and they were wed. And then they rode out and rode across the square and rode up the steps of the palace into the great hall, where the wedding feast was assembled. He on his horse, she on her mule, everyone in the kingdom celebrated their wedding, and they were very happy. I know you're wondering about this. So, towards the end of the feast, she leaned over and said, "Darling husband, being married is new to me, so if you don't mind, I will go to our bedchamber first." And he agreed. She rode her mule out of the great hall. She rode up the stairs and down the hallway until she came to the door of their bridal chamber. She looked around. No one was there. She hopped down off her mule, went inside, blew out all the candles, and closed the curtains. They had a wonderful night. And the next morning she got up very early while he was still asleep, ran out of the room, hopped on her mule, and went down to the gardens where he would meet her. They had a lovely marriage. They ruled over the kingdom fairly and well and with great compassion. And every day she would get up very early, and every night she would go to bed before he did, and he never knew. Well, one morning, a few months after they'd been married, she was in the rose gardens, riding around, admiring the roses. She loved roses. But her favorite kind of rose was a tea rose. Now, I don't know if you know about this, but tea roses are very small blooms on low bushes, but they are so fragrant. And so she rode up to the tea rose and leaned down, trying to reach one, but from the back of her mule, she couldn't. So she looked around. No one was there. She hopped down, picked some roses, and she was so entranced by their fragrance that she didn't hear the prince on his white horse riding up behind her. Now the prince rode up, and there was his wife's mule. And there was a woman standing next to the mule wearing one of his wife's dresses, but she did not look like his beautiful wife. "Hey," he said, "who are you? What have you done with my wife?" She turned around. But remember, I said she was smart? And so she thought and said, your wife, she's over there," and pointed over his shoulder. He turned to look, and she hopped back up onto her mule. When he turned back, there was his lovely wife, wearing the same dress as the homely woman and holding the same flowers. And finally, he started to get it. "Wait a minute," he said. "Wait a doggone minute. Was that you just a moment ago down on the ground, only you looked, different?" She began to weep. "Yes," she said, "yes, it was me. My mule is enchanted. I'm ugly when I'm not on the mule, and I'm beautiful when I'm on it. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to lie. I just wanted to make sure that you would keep loving me." And she buried her face in her hands and sobbed. She was so busy crying that she didn't notice the smile that began to spread across the prince's face. "Finally," he said, "I can get off of this stupid horse." And he hopped down off his horse. When he landed, he was no longer a handsome prince. At best, he was plain, and truthfully, he was pretty homely. She looked at him and gasped. She stepped, she hopped off her own mule, and they embraced. They were so happy together, and they lived happily, if not beautifully, and honestly, ever after. Thank you. Could we hear it for Libby for such wonderful sign, for such wonderful interpretation? Thank you, Libby. And Joel, welcome. All right. This next story is called Crazy Jane and the Fairy Queen. And this is an original story. I have 12 or 14 of stories that are the adventures of Crazy Jane and Red-Haired Annie. And I thought that I would introduce you to them. Crazy Jane was as mad as the moon. She was as mad as music, as mad as metaphor, as mad as melody. But it didn't matter, because she thought of her madness as a little boat that might carry her far away, but it always brought her back home again. And so it was that Crazy Jane and Red-Haired Annie were out in the town square. Now, Crazy Jane was doing what she did best. She was being a fool, juggling and doing acrobatics and calling out rhymes that were beyond compare. And Red-Haired Annie sat with her back against the sun-warmed stone of one of the buildings and watched her friend. Crazy Jane started doing somersaults and flips just as the wealthiest woman in town began to walk by. You know, the one whose nose is always so high up in the air. Crazy Jane ran up to her and skidded towards her on her knees and said, "Please, ma'am, can you spare a nickel or a dime for a poor mad fool?" But the woman just went, "Humph," and kept walking. Crazy Jane hopped up and watched as the woman walked by, her back curved like a C, and she was so fascinated by this woman's posture that Crazy Jane pushed on her own nose higher and higher until her own spine was curved in perfect imitation of the wealthy woman. She started walking along behind her, and the woman's shadow was so entranced by what Crazy Jane was doing that it lingered to watch, not noticing that the shadow's caster was far away on the other side of the square. When finally the shadow noticed, it rolled itself up and snapped back to the wealthy woman, rattling like a window shade. Red-haired Annie applauded and then said, "Crazy Jane, I have a question for you." "And what could that be?" replied Crazy Jane. This was a game they played. Red-haired Annie would come up with a question, and Crazy Jane would see if she could answer it. "Tell me," said Red-haired Annie, "how is it that leaves in the autumn go from green to red and brown?" "Pah!" replied Crazy Jane. "That's an easy one. Did you not know that there are legions of tiny little men, not more than 6 or 8 inches high? They march into the woods, and every single one of them is as naked as the day they were born, but they are all wearing tidy little leather leather aprons, and they carry in their hand a pot of paint, red or gold or brown, and they scamper up the trees and paint the leaves one by one by one. And then they run back down and hide during the day and come back in the night until all of the leaves are painted." "Ah," said Red-haired Annie, "that explains so much." And then Crazy Jane started doing somersaults and rolls and handsprings and landed in front of the town priest. "Vicar," she said, "Father, please could you spare a nickel or a dime for a poor lost soul, because you see my soles, they are falling off." And she held up one of her boots, and indeed the sole was flapping in the wind. The vicar shook his head. "Of course, my child," he said, and he handed her a bright bit of change. "Thank you, Father," she said. She tossed it up into the air, and it tumbled end over end. She caught it in her teeth, spat it out, and put it in her pocket to sit with the other coins there. And as the man was walking away, she said, "Father, beware of crocodiles." He thought to himself, what a poor mad fool. It was only many years later, when he was far away doing mission work in a distant land, that he took a walk by the river bank in the heat of the day to try and let the faint breeze cool him down. He slipped in some mud and fell into the murky water. It was only as he was sliding down that toothy gullet that he thought to himself, how did that mad woman know? But that is another story. Red-haired Annie watched Crazy Jane and then called out again, "Tell me, Crazy Jane, do you think fairy wings are more like butterfly wings or dragonfly wings?" And Crazy Jane froze. "I don't know. We'll have to find out." And off she ran to ask someone else for a bit of change to help her through the day. Red-haired Annie smiled. She watched her friend and watched all of the people in the town square. Now, I shouldn't tell you this, but of course I'm going to, that red-haired Annie too had a gift. From time to time, she might glance into someone's palms and see the truth of their life there. Not the way that you or I might read someone's fortune in their hand by the lines that are written. No. She could look into their hand and see everything that is hidden in their heart. And it was at that moment that an old woman, curved like a question mark, walked by red-haired Annie. She looked in her palm and saw the face of a girl as fresh as a spring morning, and she knew what had to be done. Crazy Jane, meanwhile, was running up to a family, a mother, a father, and more children than I could possibly count, and juggling for them higher and higher and higher. She snatched the man's hat off his head and added that to the mix, and when it was done, she tumbled the hat in the air until it landed back on his head again. The youngest of the children, a tiny little girl, said, "Mommy, Daddy, I want to be a mad fool when I grow up." At which point her mother elbowed her father, and he dug into his pocket for some coins and handed them to Crazy Jane, and the family started to walk away. Crazy Jane poured them into her pocket but for a nickel, and ran up to the little girl and held it up, and then made it disappear, and then reached behind the girl's ear and pulled it out again. The girl's eyes were so wide. Crazy Jane picked up the girl's hand and put it into her palm and closed her fingers around it. "Keep that until you need it," she said. and ran off. And so the day passed. Crazy Jane entertaining the masses, Red-Haired Annie watching them all. At the end of the day, the two friends packed up all their things when the shadows lay long in the world and began to make their way back to their little house at the edge of the wood. As they talked, they went back and forth about how they might find fairies to see what their wings looked like. "Well, I've heard," said Crazy Jane, "that if you're mad, you've been touched by fairies, but I don't think any fairy has touched me." "Well, I've heard," said Red-Haired Annie, "that if you find a circle of toadstools and step into them, the fairies will take you away." But it had been a dry season, and there were no toadstools to be found. "Well, I've heard," said Crazy Jane, "that if you turn Wittershims 3 times and call out 'Fairy, fairy, fairy,' the fairies will come get you and stop you from calling their name." And they tried, but nothing happened. They were so busy talking that the friends didn't notice that the world around them was growing dim and dark, and the walk to their little house at the edge of the woods was taking much longer than it usually did. When finally in front of them they saw a little flickering light. "Look," said Crazy Jane, "that must be the candle we left burning in the window." So they followed the light, but no matter how far they walked, the light seemed just as far away. And they walked until they stepped out of the forest into a glade. And the glade was full of fairies. Fairies on every twig and leaf and blade of grass. And in the middle of the glade there was a path of red toadstools winding up to a stump covered in green moss, and on that stump sat the Queen of Fairies. Behind her there was a girl with a face as fresh as a spring morning, with her eyes downcast, holding a tray and a cup. Crazy Jane and Red-Haired Annie looked at one another and bowed low. "Crazy Jane," said the Queen, "we heard you discussing our wings and thought we would bring you here to see them. What say you, Crazy Jane?" Crazy Jane bowed again and said, "Oh, your Majesty, your wings put the wings of butterflies and dragonflies to shame. Thank you for bringing us here to see them. You know, in gratitude, let us do something for you. The human child. She must smell terrible and no doubt eats a great deal. We will take her away so you needn't worry about her any more." And when Crazy Jane said that, the girl's face lit up, her eyes brightened with hope. "I give nothing without receiving something, Crazy Jane. What will you give me in exchange for the human child?" "Ha," said Crazy Jane, "that's easy." Now, some of you may have seen Cirque du Soleil or something like that, and you may think they are remarkable. But the performers in Cirque du Soleil look like they are standing still compared to Crazy Jane. Crazy Jane bounded back and forth and did handstands and flips and cartwheels. She ran up the trees on one side of the glade and seemed to fly across the glade itself, and then rolled down the trees on the other and stood in front of the Queen. "There," she said, "is that not something?" We are fairies. We have wings. I give nothing without receiving something, Crazy Jane. What will you give me in exchange for the human child? And the girl, whose eyes had been bright with hope, looked down at the ground. "Well," said Crazy Jane, "I know many riddles. Perhaps I could share some riddles with your Majesty." "We are fairies. We are the answer to every riddle." "Well, what about songs?" said Crazy Jane. "I could sing for you." Now the Fairy Queen thought about that for a moment, because you see, fairies love music, but lacking souls, fairies cannot create music. "Very well, Crazy Jane, you may sing for us." And the girl behind her looked up, and Crazy Jane began to sing. Now, I could sing for you the song that Crazy Jane sang, but truthfully, my singing voice isn't very good, and I'm all scratchy from allergies anyway. But even with my poor singing voice and my allergy throat, I'm much better than Crazy Jane. I could have behind me a choir of tone-deaf people, and we could all sing for you, and collectively we still would be better than Crazy Jane. Add to me and the tone-deaf choir an entire wall full of cats in heat, and still we would be better than Crazy Jane. But Crazy Jane took in a breath and opened her mouth and began to sing. And the smile that was on the Queen's face in the anticipation of music turned into a rictus. And the Queen said, "Stop!" And Crazy Jane's voice froze in her throat. "That is not singing, Crazy Jane. What will you give me in exchange for the human child?" And Crazy Jane felt her heart begin to pound. "Riddles, acrobatics, songs, stories," she said to the Fairy Queen, and the Fairy Queen said, "We know all the stories." And without her music or her riddles or her acrobatics or her stories, who was she? Tears began to trickle down the girl's face behind the Queen. And then Red-Haired Annie stepped up. "Well," she said, Perhaps this will help." And Red-Haired Annie began to whistle. Now you or I might whistle a tune while we're working to keep us company. We might whistle while we are in the dark to remind us that we truly are alone. We might whistle a little melody that almost sounds like what it's supposed to be, and a few of you might even be very good at whistling, but all of us sound like a monotone compared to Red-Haired Annie. Red-Haired Annie could whistle. And so she whistled out a lively reel, so bright and fine that the fairies couldn't help it. Their wings began to flutter, and they flew up and began to dance, whirling and swirling around with such joy and delight they were a beauty to behold. And when the reel was done, Red-Haired Annie stopped the whistle, and the fairies settled down again on twig and leaf and blade. "That was worth something," said the Fairy Queen. "That was worth enough, Crazy Jane, that I will give you something. I will give you your freedom in exchange for your friend." And with that, all of the fairies in the glade rose up and landed on Red-Haired Annie and Crazy Jane. Now, if one fairy landed on you, you wouldn't even notice. If a dozen landed on you, you would brush them away. But 100, 500, 1,000, the fairies covered Red-Haired Annie and Crazy Jane and began to beat their wings and pull them apart. Red-Haired Annie looked at Crazy Jane and saw the terror on her friend's face and the desolation on the face of the girl. She didn't know what to do, and then she did the only thing that she could. She began to sing. She sang out all of her love for Red-Haired Annie, all of her hope for the girl, and as she sang, the fairies fell off of her like leaves falling from a tree in autumn, and it spread like a ripple, and the fairies fell. Red-Haired Annie and Crazy Jane ran to the girl and grabbed a hold of her and tugged, but it was as if her feet were rooted to the ground. And then the Fairy Queen said, "Stop!" And the voice froze in Crazy Jane's throat. Fairies landed upon them again, and Crazy Jane felt tiny little fingernails pressing her lips shut. "Crazy Jane," said the Fairy Queen, "you should be grateful that I do not summon dragonflies to sew your lips shut. I will give you your freedom in exchange for your friend." And again, the dragonflies began to pull them apart. Crazy Jane couldn't open her mouth. She didn't know what she could do. She looked at Red-Haired Annie, and she felt her own heart begin to crack open at the thought of her life without her friend. And then Red-Haired Annie began to whistle. She whistled a tune so fast and bright that the fairies couldn't help themselves. They flew up into the sky, and still red-haired Annie whistled. They ran to the girl and tugged on her once, twice, thrice, and her feet broke free from the ground. And still red-haired Annie whistled, and the fairies twirled around so fast that one shot off and was ablaze across the sky. Some people thought that she was a shooting star and made wishes on her. Some of their wishes came true. And they began to move past the Fairy Queen's stump, holding on to the little girl's hands, and still red-haired Annie whistled, and another fairy flew out of the dance and went far away across the ocean and landed in the teacup of a poet, who drank her down and had the strangest dreams of Xanadu. And still red-haired Annie whistled, and the fairies flew, and they began to run across the glade, and they were almost at the edge of the glade when a root rose up and caught red-haired Annie's foot, and she fell to the ground, and the whistle was knocked out of her. And the fairies descended again and began to pull the friends apart, pull the girl back to the Fairy Queen. "You should be grateful that I let you keep your life, Crazy Jane. You will never see your friend again. Now be gone." And the fairies pulled them away. Crazy Jane could feel the shadow from the trees behind her and didn't know what to do when she felt the slap of the coins in her pocket on her thigh. She gathered up all the strength in her body and reached down into her pocket and grabbed a handful of coins. And the fairies began to fly away, because metal is to fairies what poison is to us. And she pulled her arm back and threw the coins, which tumbled end over end over end until they struck the Fairy Queen, and she shrieked. All of the fairies flew to her, and red-haired Annie and the girl met Crazy Jane, and they ran out of the glade back into the woods. They wandered through the woods until they found the path again, Crazy Jane and red-haired Annie each holding one of the girl's hands. When they got to the village, the girl looked around as if she recognized nothing, until she saw a little alley with a house at the end with a jolly green door. The girl broke free and ran to the house, pounded her fists on it, and when the old woman opened the door, the little girl looked up at her and said, "Mama, you've grown so old." The old woman, hunched like a question mark, fell on her knees in front of the girl and said, "Oh, my darling, you've been gone such a long, long time." They wrapped their arms around each other and began to weep. Crazy Jane and red-haired Annie turned and began to walk back to their little house at the edge of the wood. "Well," said red-haired Annie, "now we know what fairy wings look like." "And I never need to see them again," said Crazy Jane. They walked in companionable silence for a moment. Then Annie said, "Jane, it does seem a shame that you had to throw away all of that hard-earned money." Crazy Jane looked at her friend. "Oh, Annie, no, 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 no. Oh, my friend, that was money that was very well spent." Thank you. So can we hear it for Joel for doing such an amazing job? That's a hard story to manage, and you did a great job. Thank you, Joel. All right. So I taught a workshop today on personal stories, so I wanted to end with a personal story. I grew up in a secular household. I wasn't bat mitzvahed. I didn't know what Passover was or Yom Kippur. I knew virtually nothing about being Jewish. In fact, I think that I knew more about Santa Claus and Christmas trees than I did about Hanukkah and lighting the candles in the menorah. I really knew nothing about it. But I went to Jewish summer camp and learned a little bit and thought, well, this is okay, but it's not what we're going to do at home, and really didn't think very much of it. When I was 14 years old and in 9th grade, my history teacher picked me to represent the whole school at a citywide event. That morning, I got on the bus very early and rode one bus and then another to this building that looked kind of like a fortress, and then had another building that looked kind of like a low office building or a school next to it. I went in and found myself at a Holocaust education program. Students from all over the city I grew up in were sent there. And we sat in a great big auditorium and listened to speakers and saw the movies that we had all seen. The movies taken at the end of World War II with people who were so thin that it seemed remarkable that they could stand. And then, when it was done, we were all sent to little rooms. I settled down in my classroom, and I thought, but this is what I already know. You see, in my family, even though it was secular, all I really knew about being Jewish was that 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. And now here was more of the Holocaust. I sat in that little room with some other students, and then a woman walked in and hopped up onto the desk. She was short, so short that when she was sitting on the desk, her feet were swinging back and forth. She was plump and had an enormous bosom and lots of curly white hair. And then, as she sat there and looked at us, she very calmly held out her arm and rolled up her sleeve. And there were the numbers. She told us her story about being in the concentration camp. She told us how she and her parents and her sister and her brothers lived in a very nice house in Germany, and how her father had a business, and they went to private school, and they had lovely gifts at Hanukkah, and life was good until it wasn't. When they came to get her family, they knew it was going to happen, but so much had been taken from them already that they didn't have enough money to flee. And so when they came to get them, they sent her brothers and her father in one car, and her mother and her sister in another. She never saw her brothers or her father again. When they got to the camp, to Auschwitz, they were all put to work. Her mother died not long after they were there. She had a heart condition, and they weren't even allowed to weep for their mother's passing. And she and her sister kept working as hard as they could. But then one day, one of the guards saw them in the evening sitting on the floor, having drawn in the dust of the floor a piano keyboard, and they were taking turns practicing on the dust. The guard said, do you play the piano? He said it far less politely than that, and the girls nodded. The next day, they were brought to the commandant's house, which was clean and bright and smelled so much better than anything that they had smelled in a long, long time. There was, in the middle of the living room, a great, big, black, grand piano. He told them to sit down and said, if you really can play, things will be good for you. And so they each played for him, and they both were very good. So from that time on, they were given a little more food than everyone else, and they were made to go to work less often, and many nights they would go to the commandant's house and play. It got colder and colder, and they were told that they would play at the commandant's for Christmas, and so they went there and played. She said, when she told us all about this, she told us that everyone was very drunk, and that there were things that happened, and in that long silence, I didn't know what those things were. Now, I fear that I might, but they played anyway. They played until everyone all around them had passed out from drinking, and then they snuck out and knew that this was their only chance. There was a rumor that there was a cut in the fence, not so far away, but it was always guarded, that there was always someone nearby ready to shoot anyone who tried. But this was Christmas. All of the guards had been given a little bit of extra to drink. So they snuck there and made their way out, and she said, my back could feel the bullets, but there were none. And then they ran. We didn't have any shoes, she said. And I ran until I couldn't feel my feet anymore. I lost 3 toes that day. My sister, she lost 4. But we wouldn't have stopped if our feet had frozen and broken off. We ran as fast as we could until we came to a pile of hay, and we hid in there all through the day until it was night, and we ran again. Finally, they got someplace safe. And when they were there, they were sent from one safe house to another, until finally they found their way to America. And once they were here, even though it was many months later, she said, I wanted to light the Hanukkah candles because we had missed Hanukkah and I missed the light. So we lit the candles and we put it in the window so we could say, and then she used very harsh language that I won't use with you now. So I could say to all of them, we are still here. That light from the candles means we are still here. And she told us about her life in America. And when she was done, time was up, and everyone made their way out of the room except for me. I stayed in that seat, and I looked up at her and said, how do we know it won't happen here? She got up and walked over to me and embraced me. My face was buried in her bosom, and she had that old lady smell of sweat and baby powder, and I began to cry. She rocked me back and forth and said, it is okay, child. It is okay. I am okay. I survived. They didn't get me. And it won't happen here because this is America. And when I was done crying, she patted my cheek, gave me a tissue, and sent me home. And I grew up. Once I was living on my own, I started putting Hanukkah candles in the window and learning about Passover and about other things, learning about thousands of years of history, not just that 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust, because there was at least one who didn't. Every year in December, I would light those candles and put them in my window to say, we are still here. Not so long ago, I was living in Kansas City. And that year, right around Hanukkah, Jewish cemeteries not so far from where I lived were being desecrated, and we were afraid. So I wasn't sure if I should put my menorah in the window. I called my landlord and asked her, my landlady, and I told her why I was worried. I was worried someone would break the glass. I was worried that her home would be damaged, and she listened to me and said, you know what? Put up 2. And so I put up the menorah. I looked at those lights flickering and at my own face reflecting back at me in the glass and the reflection of the glass. And I remembered what that woman had said to me after she had patted my cheek to send me out in the world. She said, you know what I decided when I survived? I decided I would be like those Hanukkah lights, and I would say to them, I am still here. But what's more, I decided that I would bring light, not darkness, into the world. And that's what you should do, she said to me. Go out, be a light in the world. I sat in my apartment, which was so cold. I watched the lights flicker. The window wasn't broken. And I thought about being a light in the world. And so that is what I say to you. This always gets me. Go out. Let them know you are still here. Be a light in the world.
Thank
Thank you.
Laura. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Fran. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Libby, too, wherever you are.
We'll need some time to digest that story. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran.
We've heard a traditional folktale from the San people. We've heard a fairy tale modified, the one about the donkey. I didn't recognize anything in that at all. I wonder.
It was based on Beauty and the Beast. It started with thinking about what can I do about Beauty and the Beast.
A very different take on beauty.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very wonderful. And the story of Crazy Jane and red-haired Annie and the fairies. Mm-hmm. Always remember to keep some pocket change handy. And the story of the light in the window. I don't know what you call that, but
lighten the world or 6 million plus one. Depends on the day.
Yes. Yes. Timely. When you were in ninth grade, who would have thought?
Yeah.
Thank you, Laura, for your stories. Thanks to Joel and Livy for their sign interpreting. Thanks to David for his music. Thanks to Valerie for her grant writing. Thanks to Chester and Eldrina Doma, who was the head of the committee who put this conference, this festival together, and she has been dealing with the death of her father-in-law.
Oh.
So we haven't seen her as much as we hoped to, but this concert is recorded, and for all of you who have registered, you will be able to watch the recording for another month after this, I think, and so we'll make sure that Drina gets to see this. I promised I would put Laura's books into the chat line for you. Let's see. And also she has, oh goodness, get my documents here. And some contact information, because particularly if you have taken a workshop with her, you are entitled to a brief free coaching session, which we've already heard from others who have taken her workshops with coaching about the amazing transformations, the discoveries in their stories that they got from that. So we can stay around for a little while longer. Chester is going to moderate some informal discussion. If you have questions for Laura or more things that you would like to say to her or ask her, you can unmute yourself, and you can use the reaction button at the bottom to raise your hand so that we know that you have a question, because we have a couple screens full of people here, and it's hard to find them if they don't raise their hands. She's already told us that the story about the donkey and the princess started with Beauty and the Beast. Did you tell that version at one of the Stories with Spirit?
No, I actually haven't. When they did Beauty and the Beast, I wasn't one of the tellers. I've told they've been kind enough to invite me to a number of those performances, and I've told other stories, and it's been fun because I've gotten to come up with some new stuff. But no, I've been fracturing fairy tales for a long time. And I thought this, I don't know, I really like her. I think she's got spunk and spirit. So it's fun to share her.
People, if you don't know about the Stories with Spirit, that's been not every month, but maybe every other month, a session where they take one story and they have 4 or 5 storytellers. One person tells the story in the conventional way, and then the others take off in different directions. And those of us who were fortunate enough to attend Winter Tales in the years that Oklahoma City Festival flourished, it was Lynn Maroney's idea to do that kind of a workshop where all of the featured tellers were challenged to come up with a story in their own voice. And we have seen, there's been a lot of new minted gold was thrown at our feet at those sessions. And so it's delightful to see Stories with Spirit continuing that tradition. Yes, don't forget the evaluation form. Got to put that in the chat line again for you, because we need that in order for the our grant. Got to have that kind of thing. see.
The only thing I'm going to say about the evaluation, and I understand it
fine.
because I've written grants before, and I realize they need to have statistics as to where people attended from and everything. But in item number 6, okay, it asks us all of these questions, and the whole idea of the evaluation is anonymity. But in item number 6, it says, please give your city, state, and zip code. This is a required field. Well, being
Oh.
from Goodwell, Oklahoma, I think it's pretty easy to figure out what my comments were. So I
Oh,
do have an issue with that in particular.
Well, lie. Hey, Fran, I would like to do one brief commercial for Laura, if I could. She has, I don't remember what the terminology is, but she has this monthly or weekly or whatever subscription service you can join. And if you sign up, the danger is you'll get a flood of stuff. But you know what? In all that flood, every once in a while, something comes along that's kind of interesting and helpful. So I would recommend you take a look at that. And Laura, I don't remember what you call that, but every once in a while, there's something comes along. It's just, it's kind of a nice little thing.
Thank you,
And I
Chester.
appreciate all that. I don't know how you get the energy.
I don't know either, actually. So what Chester's talking about is my Patreon. So Patreon is a service where if there's an artist whose work you like, you can sign up and send them a little money each month and get stuff in return. So mine ranges from $3 a month on up. At $3, you get posts, blog posts, and access to a monthly chat. We have a monthly meeting, and a story seed, which is a little story starter. $5, you get stories, which you don't get at $3, and then you get more and more. $15, you get signed books, and it's really fun for me because it makes me think about what I want to share. I try not to make it too much of a flood. I try not to post more often than once a week, though on weeks with rewards I do. And my hope is that it's useful, that I share useful, interesting stuff. And you can find it. The link is in one of the links that Fran shared, but I will copy and paste that one specifically. Thank you so much, Chester. This is actually, quite honestly, whoops. Really important financial support for me. It means that I can keep being an independent artist even through things like a pandemic. So thank you for mentioning that. I appreciate it. I would love it if any of you would like to join me. I think we have a lot of fun. I actually have a question that's unrelated to storytelling. Tim, could I see your dog? Oh, what a sweetie. Thank you. I also, just so you know, starting on Monday, I'm starting a 3-session class called The Art and Craft of Deep Listening. So session 1 is about listening to yourself. Session 2 is about listening to others. Session 3 is about teaching others to listen. And I have another concert coming up in July, and all the links are up there as well. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a
I
real
want
honor.
to mention this book again.
That's from Audience to Zeal.
Yes.
There are
yes.
about 80 some odd essays on lots of different issues in storytelling.
And they are alphabetical by the title, but that doesn't mean that they're alphabetical by concept. So it's a kind of a random deluge of brilliant ideas. And like different flavors of jelly beans, I don't recommend eating a handful at once. That you can't, that doesn't work. But I recommend maybe taking one and think about it and then read the next one, because they're all very short.
Which was my intent. My hope was that it would be, you'd read one, it would send you off in a direction that you hadn't thought of before, and then you'd come back and read something else.
You know, Fran, I'd also like, you were thanking some folks, I'd like to add a couple of people to that list. Of course, we started off Friday night with Carol Saunders Young, the excellent musician. She was a lot of fun, talented lady. Anybody who's playing venues when you're 14 years old must have some substance to her.
And
That was
she's
very
playing,
nice.
she's playing for a contra dance tonight, which is why she's not with us tonight, but
Okay.
she's looking forward to the recording.
I think she was glad to get her professional career as a nurse over with so she can go do what she really loved. So that is great. And also that night, of course, we had a featured teller. We had Rosie Cottrell, our favorite Kansan. And so, Rosie, we're really glad to have you. And I told you, I always enjoy just whatever you do. It's just fun. And we had some pretty good stories, individuals too, locally that night. And I thought it was, I just loved it. I also don't want to forget the tech team behind the scenes. Dean, Keith, were just absolutely amazing. I hope we don't ever ruin you completely, but you are just, and I know we're a lot more fun to work with than those Texas folks, but you just hang in there the best you can. And Tony helped some out, and Stephanie Scott was in there quite a bit, and I had helped a little bit, but anyway, it really do appreciate what you did, and it's really scary not to have you behind that blank screen. It's a kind of a good thing.
We are very
Thanks.
grateful to be swapping talent with our cousins in Baja, Oklahoma, on the other side of the Red River.
Well, anyway, I'll see. Also, again, I want to say Recco, that Eldrina and her team put together a really nice concert. And I know it was tough for Eldrina not to be here, but part of the reason she didn't have to be here is because they'd done so much work in the planning and getting ready. And so you have to give good credit for that. So I do appreciate that. So anything, I want to thank the whole group for the privilege of serving this past year and helping along. Now I'm going to get to be an observer and enjoy the stuff. And so we'll turn it over to anybody else who'd like to share a few comments. And Tim, we're always glad to see you. Fred, we're always glad to see you too. I can't think of anything really witty to say at this point, but shouldn't keep me from talking.
Lady friend, you know, I lived 30 years in Oklahoma, so I'm a man without a country. And I used to say to the Texas boys, I said, you know how you get out of Oklahoma? You walk west until you smell it, and you walk south until you step in it. Good night, folks.
Glad to have you with us, Fred.
Thank you.
Esther,
Thank
did
you.
you take any pictures this year?
I took a few. It's always a challenge on the Zoom screen.
Yeah.
Everybody looks distorted. And you know, the tricky thing about taking pictures of storytellers, they're always talking. And I tell you what I'm going to do right now. I'm glad you said that, Liz. And by the way, I also want to say a special word to Liz. This past year, when I had a puzzle or two come up, it was not unusual for me to pick up the phone and call Liz and just kind of pick her brain. I've always appreciated that about you, Liz, being there. But I want everybody to look into their camera and smile your best. Pretend like you're actually getting paid for doing this stuff. 1, 2, 3. And one more time. 1, 2, 3. 3. One more, 3. Okay. Now we'll have something maybe good enough for the newsletter.
Oh, in the
So I'm
world.
going to shut up and let you talk among yourselves, and we'll see what happens.
So how can you take that